Hello everyone, and welcome to the M.O.W channel. Today, we're diving into one of Canada's most horrifying true crime cases. The story of Robert William Pickton, the butcher who brutally murdered at least 29 women in Vancouver. Please like and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin today's case file. Robert William Pickton's notorious story is rooted in two starkly contrasting sides of Canadian society: the light and the very darkest shadows. The first is Vancouver's downtown east side, or Dietz, one of the most impoverished and marginalized areas in the country. For decades, it has been home to sex workers, drug users, and Indigenous women who face deep social discrimination. These women, often struggling with poverty and addiction, were invisible to mainstream society. Their disappearances rarely made headlines, and for predators, they were easy targets. Dietz was a constant reminder of Canada's social inequality, plagued by high crime, poor living conditions, and systemic neglect. Police and the justice system often turned a blind eye. Many missing person reports were dismissed as people just leaving town. The lives of these women simply didn't seem to matter to the authorities. The second setting is a pig farm, about 27 kilometers east of Vancouver, in Port Coquitlam. This was where Robert Pickton was born, raised, and where his gruesome crimes unfolded over decades. His early life on that isolated farm shaped much of his twisted personality. Pickton grew up under a harsh, domineering mother who cared more about her pigs than her children. The boys went to school in filthy, manure-scented clothes and were bullied mercilessly by classmates, earning the nickname Stinky Pig. That constant humiliation left Robert socially isolated and full of resentment, especially toward women and society in general. He dropped out of school in 1963, briefly worked as a butcher, then returned to the family farm full-time. After his parents died, the Pickton brothers sold part of the land to developers, earning a large sum of money that allowed them to live a strange, reclusive lifestyle. Robert eventually turned the farm into a hidden playground for his darkest impulses. He converted one of the barns into an illegal nightclub called Piggy's Palace. It became infamous for wild parties attended by local politicians, businessmen, and sex workers from Dietz. For Pickton, Piggy's Palace was the perfect hunting ground, a place where he could lure vulnerable women from the anonymity of the city into his own domain. He knew that if these women went missing, no one, not even the police, would care enough to look for them seriously. Pickton's killing spree is believed to have begun in the 1980s, but there was a chance to stop him much earlier. In March 1997, he tried to murder a sex worker named Wendy Lynn Eistetter. He took her to his farm, handcuffed her, and stabbed her, but she fought back and managed to escape, eventually reporting him to the police. Pickton was charged with attempted murder, but in January 1998, prosecutors dropped the case. They argued that Eistetter's drug use made her an unreliable witness. It was a fatal mistake. Pickton walked free after paying just $2,000 Canadian in bail, and continued killing, now more confident than ever that he would never be caught. By the late 1990s, the number of missing women in Dietz had grown alarmingly high. Rumors of a serial killer began spreading. A worker at Pickton's farm even found women's purses and reported them to the police. Officers searched the property 3 times but failed to find anything significant. They never checked inside the main buildings or deeper areas of the farm. In 1999, police even received a tip about a freezer full of human meat on Pickton's property, but they ignored it. These failures reflected a larger systemic problem. The police simply didn't take the disappearances of poor, Indigenous, or addicted women seriously. They assumed these women had left voluntarily or fallen victim to drugs, not a killer. Pickton exploited every gap in the system. His pig farm became a nightmare, a graveyard where countless women vanished without a trace. Their families begged for help, but their voices were drowned out by indifference and silence. Robert Pickton's long string of murders finally came to an end, and his secret pig farm of horrors was exposed on February 6, 2002, almost by accident. The turning point in the case came not from a murder investigation, but from a police search for illegal firearms. When officers from the Vancouver Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police executed a search warrant on Pickton's farm, they stumbled upon personal belongings belonging to several missing women from Vancouver's downtown east side. This discovery changed everything. It was clear that the pig farm wasn't just a place for livestock. It was at the center of one of Canada's most disturbing missing person cases. Based on what they found, investigators quickly obtained a second warrant, sealed off the entire property, and launched a massive forensic excavation known as the BC Missing Women Investigation. The search that followed became one of the largest and most expensive criminal investigations in Canadian history. By the end of 2003, the province of British Columbia had spent nearly 70 million Canadian dollars on the case, a reflection of both its scale and its horror. Every inch of Pickton's farm was carefully examined. The area was completely closed off, and all the buildings, except for one small shed, were torn down so investigators could collect evidence. Detectives knew they faced a nightmare task. Pickton had claimed that some of the victims' bodies had been fed to his pigs or left to decompose for years, meaning only tiny traces like teeth or bone fragments might remain. Gathering forensic evidence under those conditions was incredibly difficult. Forensic anthropologists and scientists brought in heavy machinery and advanced technology to sift through the dirt. Conveyor belts and fine mesh screens were installed across the property, and teams of investigators spent months literally filtering the soil, by hand, handful by handful. Eventually, their relentless work paid off. The remains, DNA, and belongings of more than 20 missing women were discovered on the property. Among the most critical evidence were Pickton's own clothes and boots. From his 1997 attempted murder case, forensic testing revealed the DNA of two other women, Andrea Burhaven and Cara Ellis, proving that Pickton had been killing for years and linking him directly to multiple victims. As the investigation deepened, horrifying details began to surface about how Pickton killed and disposed of his victims. Friends and acquaintances told police about disturbing conversations they had with him, where he bragged about what he had done. According to one witness, Pickton would handcuff and strangle his victims, drain their blood, and then feed their remains to his pigs. One of the most shocking revelations came in March 2004, when the government publicly warned that Pickton might have mixed human flesh with pork he sold to the public. The statement came from British Columbia's health authorities and sent waves of fear and disgust throughout the region. It showed just how far Pickton had gone, turning his farm not only into a killing ground, but also into a gruesome machine for destroying evidence. Based on the overwhelming forensic evidence and witness testimony, Robert Pickton was first charged on February 22, 2002, with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Serena Abotsway and Mona Wilson. As investigators continued searching the farm and analyzing DNA, the number of charges steadily grew. By May 2005, Pickton was charged with 27 counts of first-degree murder, making him one of the most prolific serial killers ever charged in Canadian history. The evidence and case files from this investigation became the foundation for the trials that followed, exposing not only the staggering scale of Pickton's crimes, but also the deep societal failures that allowed them to happen. This chapter of the story marked more than just the capture of a murderer. It forced Canada to confront one of the darkest truths in its modern history. After Robert Pickton's arrest and the shocking discovery of what lay hidden on his farm, Canada entered a deep crisis of faith in its entire justice system. This wasn't just about putting one serial killer on trial, it became a painful reckoning with the police's long-standing bias, systemic neglect, and society's indifference toward missing and marginalized women. Once Pickton was charged, the Vancouver Police Department had to face the public and admit its failures. In an emotional press conference, the deputy chief publicly apologized to the families of the victims, acknowledging that the investigation had been delayed and mishandled. He said he deeply wished Pickton had been caught sooner, and admitted that many agencies could have and should have done far better. This apology marked the first time the police officially recognized their institutional failure to take the growing number of missing women cases in the downtown East Side seriously during the 1990s. For years, they had written the disappearances off as runaways or social problems, ignoring what was clearly the work of a serial killer. Much of the outrage centered around the handling of the 1997 attempted murder case and the early tips about Pickton's farm. When sex worker Wendy Lynn Eistetter escaped from Pickton and reported the attack, prosecutors dismissed her case, claiming she wasn't a credible witness because of her history of drug use. Later, when one of Pickton's employees found the wallets of missing women and reported them, and again in 1999, when someone tipped off police about a freezer full of human remains, officers still failed to act. These repeated failures exposed a deep-rooted prejudice within the system against sex workers, drug users, and especially Indigenous women. The investigation also suffered from bureaucratic infighting, jurisdictional disputes between police departments, a lack of resources, and an unwillingness to believe that a serial killer might be targeting women no one else seemed to care about. All of these problems gave Pickton the time he needed to continue killing. As public anger grew, Pickton's trial began on January 30, 2006, in New Westminster. He pleaded not guilty to 27 counts of first-degree murder. The legal process was extremely long and complicated. The preliminary voir dire phase, which determines what evidence can be shown to the jury, alone took almost a year. A sweeping publication ban was put in place, preventing reporters from sharing details of the case, which left the public in the dark about much of what was happening inside the courtroom. One of the most controversial and painful moments of the trial came in August 2006. Judge James Williams ruled that all 27 murder charges could not be tried together, saying that doing so would overwhelm the jury and risk causing a mistrial. Instead, he divided the charges into two groups: 6 counts to be tried first, and the remaining 20 to be dealt with later. For the victims' families, this decision felt like a devastating betrayal. Many felt that their loved ones' stories were being silenced, and that justice was being postponed indefinitely. They accused the legal system of prioritizing the convenience of the accused over the dignity and closure of the victims. The Pickton case became a national symbol of how law enforcement and the justice system can fail the most vulnerable members of society, and how those failures can allow unthinkable tragedy to unfold. During the trial, police presented shocking video evidence of Pickton bragging to an undercover officer that he had killed 49 women. Yet even that chilling confession couldn't fully deliver justice for all of his victims. The complexity of the law and the limitations of the court system meant that not every case would be heard, not every name would be spoken. In the end, the Pickton case was far more than the story of a murderer. It was a mirror reflecting a much larger truth, a social and institutional crisis that had been ignored for far too long, until it finally exploded into public view. After years of excavation, police controversy, and complex legal proceedings, the Robert Pickton case finally reached its legal climax in December 2007. The trial focused on only 6 of the 27 murder charges filed against him: those of Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Josberry, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Papon, and Marnie Leanne Frey. The courtroom presentations were deeply disturbing, as horrifying details of Pickton's crimes on his farm were revealed, shocking the entire Canadian public. The jury's deliberation over Pickton's guilt was long and agonizing. They had to review his recorded confession, DNA and body fragments found on the farm, and bizarre physical evidence, such as a gun fitted with a dildo. On December 9, 2007, after lengthy deliberations, the jury delivered its final verdict. They found Pickton not guilty of first-degree murder in all 6 cases. First-degree murder required proof of premeditation and intent beyond a reasonable doubt, and the prosecution failed to meet that standard. But this did not mean that Pickton was innocent. The jury found him guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder instead. Second-degree murder applies when a killing is intentional but not premeditated. This verdict legally confirmed that Pickton had indeed murdered the 6 women. For the victims' families, the decision brought mixed emotions: relief that justice had finally been served, but disappointment that the full brutality of his crimes was not recognized as first-degree murder. 2 days later, on December 11, 2007, Justice James Williams of the British Columbia Supreme Court returned to deliver the sentence. Before the ruling, the court heard 18 victim impact statements written by family members. These statements went far beyond listing the facts of the crimes. They spoke of the endless pain of missing loved ones, years of being ignored, and the grief and rage of losing someone to such cruelty. The families' voices filled the courtroom with emotion, showing that Pickton's actions destroyed not just lives but entire families and communities. After listening to the statements, Justice Williams handed down the harshest sentence possible. Under Canadian law for second-degree murder, life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. This was the maximum penalty allowed, and effectively the same as the sentence for first-degree murder. In his sentencing remarks, Justice Williams condemned Pickton's crimes as murderous, repetitive, senseless, and vile, stating that the court had imposed the strongest punishment available to the justice system. This maximum sentence marked the legal peak of the Pickton case. It ensured that the serial killer would be permanently removed from society, and gave the victims' families a measure of justice. After years of pain and uncertainty, yet, the verdict was not a full resolution. Pickton had been convicted of only 6 murders, while he had confessed to killing 49 and faced 20 additional charges that were never brought to trial. Those unresolved cases left a painful sense of incompletion, a reminder that even in its most decisive moment, the justice system could not fully account for the scope of the tragedy. The guilty verdict and maximum sentence in the Robert Pickton case brought the legal proceedings to a close, but the true ending of the case left behind a heavy legacy of unresolved controversy and structural change across Canadian society. On December 11, 2007, Pickton was sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of parole for 25 years for 6 counts of second-degree murder. His conviction was finalized in July 2010, when the Supreme Court of Canada dismissed his final appeal. However, a major issue remained the other 21st-degree murder charges that had been put on hold. In August 2010, the British Columbia Crown formally discontinued those charges, citing a practical reason. Pickton was already serving the maximum sentence for second-degree murder, so additional convictions would not affect his time in prison. This decision sparked outrage and despair among the victims' families. For the families of the 20 additional victims, it meant losing the last chance to have their loved ones' deaths officially recognized in court. They were furious that Pickton would be held legally responsible for only 6 murders, while his confessed 49 killings would remain legally unproven. Justice had been served in part, but it remained incomplete. From the perspective of judicial efficiency, the Crown's decision made sense. But from the standpoint of victims' justice, it was a clear failure. The most important and lasting legacy of the Pickton case was its impact on public and government awareness of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls' M.O.W. crisis in Canada. Many of Pickton's victims were Indigenous, and the investigation revealed that their disappearances had long been ignored or dismissed by police. The case highlighted how systemic bias and societal neglect toward marginalized groups effectively enabled and amplified Pickton's crimes. In response, the British Columbia government established the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry to investigate the failures in the Pickton investigation. The commission's report criticized the lack of cooperation between the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP, the shortage of investigative resources, and the deep-rooted police culture that neglected vulnerable victims. The report became a landmark acknowledgement that Canada's justice and law enforcement systems had failed to protect society's most at-risk members. Public outrage and ongoing advocacy by victims' families eventually led to a national-level investigation into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In 2016, the Canadian government launched this national inquiry. The Pickton case thus became more than the story of a single killer. It exposed how structural racism, gender-based violence, and systemic neglect combined to produce a large-scale societal tragedy. Robert Pickton himself was transferred from Kent Institution in British Columbia to the Port Cartier facility in Quebec, where he continued serving his sentence. On May 19, 2024, he was attacked by another inmate and died of complications on May 31. His death marked the end of the life of one of Canada's most notorious serial killers, but it was another form of unresolved closure. For some families, it may have felt like justice, but for those hoping for full legal accountability for all of his crimes, it left lingering questions. The site of Pickton's pig farm is now fenced off and managed by the government of British Columbia, bearing the scars of its horrific past. The Pickton case forced Canada to confront long-hidden societal darkness and left a lasting lesson about reforming the justice system and protecting vulnerable communities. The legacy of Pickton lies less in his crimes themselves than in the social conditions that allowed them, and the national effort to address and prevent such failures in the future. That's it for today's case file. Please make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. We'll be back tomorrow with a new case and more mysteries. Thank you for watching.